The Eastern Front, June 1941. The German Wehrmacht had unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion force in human history, crashing across the Soviet border with over 3 million men, 3,600 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft. In the opening weeks, the Red Army reeled backward in chaos and confusion, losing entire divisions to encirclement, watching their mechanized corps shattered by the Luftwaffe's relentless dive bombers and the coordinated punch of Panzer Divisions. But this is not a story about grand strategy or the movement of armies across maps. This is a story about one man, one broken machine, and an act of mechanical genius so audacious that it would inspire an entire tank crew to accomplish what Soviet high command deemed impossible. His name was Ivan Pavlovich Kolesnikov. He was 24 years old, a senior sergeant in the 15th Tank Division, 10th Mechanized Corps, and he was not supposed to be a hero. Kolesnikov was a mechanic, a tankery mechanic, assigned to maintain the KV-1 heavy tanks that were the pride of Stalin's armored forces. The KV-1, named after Soviet Defense Commissar Klimen Voroshilov, was a 43-ton monster armed with a 76.2 millimeters F-32 tank gun and protected by armor up to 90 millimeters thick on the turret front. When it worked, the KV-1 was nearly invincible against German anti-tank guns of 1941. German 37 millimeters and 50 millimeters shells simply bounced off its sloped armor like pebbles off a cathedral wall. But when it broke down, and Soviet tanks broke down constantly due to poor manufacturing tolerances, inadequate crew training, and the brutal operational tempo of the early war, the KV-1 became a 43-ton paperweight. On June 23, 1941, the second day of the German invasion, Kolesnikov's unit was stationed near the small Lithuanian town of Raseiniai, approximately 80 kilometers northwest of Kaunas. The 15th Tank Division had been rushed forward to blunt the spearhead of General Erich von Manstein's LVI Panzer Corps, which was driving deep into Soviet territory with terrifying speed. The Red Army's response was confused and piecemeal. Orders contradicted each other. Supply columns were strafed by German fighters. Tank companies advanced without infantry support, without reconnaissance, straight into carefully prepared German defensive positions. Kolesnikov's KV-1, designated tank number 864, was part of a hasty counterattack order for the morning of June 24th. The plan, if it could be called that, was simple. Drive the German advance guard off a critical crossroads southeast of Raseiniai and buy time for Soviet infantry divisions to establish defensive lines. The crew of 864 consisted of 5 men: Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov, the commander; Sergeant Nikolai Mirov, the gunner; Private Alexei Yusov, the loader; Private Boris Petrov, the driver; and Kolesnikov himself, the mechanic radio man. They rolled out at dawn, engines growling, tracks clanking over the dirt roads. The summer morning was already warm. Dust hung in the air, mixed with the acrid smell of burning villages in the distance. German artillery had been working over the Soviet rear areas all night. The crew of 864 could see columns of black smoke rising from fuel dumps and supply depots. Lieutenant Konovalov stood in the turret hatch, scanning the horizon with binoculars. He was 31 years old, a career officer who had served in the Finnish Winter War. He knew what German armor could do. He had read the intelligence reports about the Panzer's performance in France. But he also knew that his KV-1, with its thick armor and powerful gun, was superior to anything the Germans could field. On paper, the reality of combat is never clean. At approximately 7:15 hours, Tank 864 crested a low hill and came under immediate fire from German positions concealed in a tree line 800 meters ahead. The first rounds were 50 millimeters armor-piercing shot from Panzer III tanks. They struck 864's frontal armor with sharp, ringing impacts and did absolutely nothing. The German gunners must have been horrified. They had been told that Soviet tanks were obsolete, poorly armored, easy prey for German gunnery. The KV-1 proved them catastrophically wrong. Konovalov ordered Mayorov to return fire. The 76.2 millimeters gun roared. The first shot was high. The second struck a Panzer III squarely in the hull, penetrating through both sides of the tank and killing the crew instantly. The German tanks began to withdraw, reversing frantically, trying to put terrain between themselves and the Soviet behemoth that shrugged off their best shots. But then the ground betrayed them. At 7:23 hours, as Petrov attempted to maneuver 864 into a hull-down position behind an embankment, the right track rolled over a drainage ditch concealed by tall grass. The front right road wheel assembly, already weakened by poor Soviet metallurgy, and the strain of high-speed maneuvering, snapped. Metal shrieked. The entire suspension arm collapsed. The tank lurched violently to the right and ground to a halt, listing at a 15-degree angle. Petrov gunned the engine, trying to reverse. The left track spun uselessly. The right track was completely immobilized. Tank 864 was dead in the water, immobilized, vulnerable, and sitting less than a kilometer from German lines. Konovalov's voice crackled over the intercom. Kolesnikov, damage report. Now, Kolesnikov had already dropped through the belly hatch, crawling under the 43-ton machine, even as German machine gun fire began to snap through the grass around him. What he saw made his stomach drop. The road wheel arm hadn't just bent. It had fractured completely at the mounting bracket. The wheel itself was canted at an impossible angle, jammed against the inside of the track. To repair this properly would require a recovery vehicle, a crane, a workshop, replacement parts, and at least 8 hours of work. They had perhaps 8 minutes before German infantry would flank their position. Kolesnikov crawled back inside and delivered his report. Comrade Lieutenant, the suspension is destroyed. We cannot move. The intercom fell silent. Every man in that crew knew what immobilization meant. Standard Soviet doctrine was clear. Abandon disabled tanks. Destroy them if possible, withdraw on foot. The Germans were experts at recovering and repairing captured Soviet equipment. A KV-1 in German hands was unacceptable. But Konovalov made a different choice. We hold this position, he said quietly. Kolesnikov, can you get us firing again? The gun works, Comrade Lieutenant. The engine works. We just can't move. Then we don't need to move. Load high explosive. Mayorov, target that tree line. If we're going to die here, we're taking as many fascists with us as we can. What Konovalov did not know, what none of them knew, was that their mobilized KV-1 was sitting almost directly on top of the main supply route for the German 6th Panzer Division's advance. The crossroads behind them was the only hard surface road capable of handling heavy traffic for 20 kilometers in any direction. Every German supply truck, every fuel Bowser, every ammunition convoy had to pass within 400 meters of Tank 864's gun. The Germans would soon discover they had a very serious problem, and Ivan Kolesnikov, the mad mechanic, was about to do something that would be talked about in Soviet tank crews for the rest of the war. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you're enjoying this deep dive into real World War II history, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell. These stories take extensive research, and your support helps us bring more forgotten tales to light. The German advance had been, until this moment, a masterpiece of military coordination. General Erich von Manstein's LVI Panzer Corps was executing a textbook blitzkrieg operation, fast-moving armor punching through weak points, infantry following to consolidate gains, supply columns racing forward to keep the panzers fueled and armed. The entire system depended on momentum, on roads, on logistics moving smoothly from rear areas to the front. Tank 864 was about to break that system. At 8:45 hours on June 24th, 1941, the first German supply convoy approached the crossroads. It consisted of 12 Opel Blitz trucks carrying ammunition and fuel for the forward panzer units, escorted by a single SD, KFZ 222 armored car. The convoy commander had been assured that this sector was secure, that Soviet forces were in full retreat. They drove at normal road speed, approximately 40 kilometers per hour, expecting nothing more dangerous than occasional partisan sniper fire. Sergeant Mirov, the gunner of Tank 864, watched them approach through his periscope sight. His hand rested on the turret traverse wheel. Lieutenant Konovalov's voice was calm in his headset. Range 350 meters. High explosive loaded. Fire when ready. The KV-1 76.2 millimeters gun fired. The first truck in the convoy erupted in a ball of orange flame as a high explosive shell detonated directly in its cargo bed, which had been carrying 122 millimeters artillery shells. The explosion was so violent that it flipped the second truck completely off the road. The remaining vehicles scattered in panic, drivers cranking their steering wheels, trying desperately to reverse or find cover. Mayorov fired again, and again. Within 90 seconds, 7 trucks were burning. The armored car attempted to return fire with its 20mm autocannon, but the round simply sparked off the KV-1's armor without effect. Mayarov took his time, adjusted his aim, and put a shell through the armored car's thin side plating. It brewed up instantly. The surviving German vehicles fled back down the road, leaving a column of black smoke rising into the morning sky, a smoke column that could be seen for kilometers in every direction, a smoke column that announced to every German unit in the area, something is very wrong at that crossroads. Inside Tank 864, the crew was experiencing a strange mixture of exhilaration and terror. They had just destroyed an entire German supply convoy, but they were also completely immobilized, sitting in the open with no support, no avenue of escape. Private Yusov, the loader, was working frantically to keep shells moving from the ready rack to the breach. The confined space inside the turret was already thick with cordite smoke and the smell of hot metal. Kolesnikov, meanwhile, had made a decision that would define everything that followed. He could not repair the broken suspension. Not here, not under fire, not without proper tools. But he could do something almost as important. He could keep this tank fighting for as long as possible. He began a systematic inventory of everything functional in the tank. The V2 diesel engine, operational. The electrical system, operational. The main gun, operational. The coaxial 7.62mm DT machine gun, operational. The radio, operational, though there was no one answering their transmissions. The entire Soviet command structure in this sector had collapsed into chaos. Ammunition, 42 rounds of 76.2mm remaining, plus approximately 2,000 rounds of 7.62mm for machine guns. Fuel, 3/4 of a tank, roughly 450 liters. If they rationed carefully, if they didn't waste ammunition, if the engine didn't overheat from running stationary for extended periods, they could hold this position for perhaps 12 to 18 hours before something critical broke down. Kolesnikov shared his assessment with Lieutenant Konovalov. The lieutenant's response was characteristically terse. Then we fight for 18 hours. What none of them knew was that their little ambush had already created chaos in the German rear areas. The surviving truck drivers had reported encountering a heavily armed Soviet position directly on the main supply route. German intelligence officers, studying maps and trying to reconcile conflicting reports, assumed they were facing a prepared defensive position with multiple tanks, possibly an entire tank company supported by anti-tank guns and infantry. The reality, one immobilized KV, one with a 5-man crew, seemed too absurd to be true. At 10:30 hours, the Germans sent a reconnaissance force to probe the position. 3 Panzer III tanks and 2 platoons of infantry mounted in half-tracks. They approached cautiously, using terrain for cover, expecting to encounter a strong defensive position. What they found instead was a single Soviet tank, sitting at an angle in an open field, apparently undamaged but strangely motionless. The German tank commander, Hauptmann Klaus Becker of the 1st Battalion, 11th Panzer Regiment, studied the KV-1 through binoculars from a distance of approximately 1,200 meters. Something about the situation felt wrong. Why would a single Soviet tank remain in such an exposed position? Was it bait for an ambush? Were there other Soviet tanks concealed in the surrounding terrain? Becker made the tactically sound decision to engage from maximum range. His 3 Panzer III spread out in a rough line and began firing. The 50mm armor-piercing round struck Tank 864's hull and turret with sharp, ringing impacts and accomplished exactly nothing. The range was too great, the angle too oblique, the KV-1's armor too thick. Not a single round penetrated. Inside Tank 864, the impact sounded like hammers striking an enormous bell. The crew's ears rang. Flakes of paint and rust shook loose from the interior walls, but the armor held. Lieutenant Konovalov's voice was ice calm. Mayarov, target the left tank. Range 1,200. Fire when ready. The problem was that the KV-1's gun sights were not particularly sophisticated. Soviet optical equipment in 1941 was adequate for ranges under 800 meters, but became increasingly unreliable at longer distances. Mayarov had to compensate for a bullet drop, for wind, for the slight mechanical slop in the turret traverse system. He fired. The shot fell short, kicking up a geyser of dirt 50 meters in front of the lead Panzer III. Mayarov adjusted his aim elevated the gun barrel slightly. He fired again. This time the shell screamed through the air and struck the Panzer III's turret with devastating effect. The German tank didn't explode. It simply stopped, smoke pouring from every hatch. The crew bailed out, running for cover. The other two German tanks immediately began to reverse, putting terrain between themselves and the Soviet monster. The infantry half-tracks, seeing their armor support withdrawing, likewise pulled back. Within minutes, the German reconnaissance force had retreated beyond visual range. Becker radioed his battalion commander with a disturbing report. There was at least one Soviet heavy tank at the crossroads, hull down, apparently well-positioned, and completely immune to 50 millimeters gunfire. He recommended calling up 88 millimeters anti-aircraft guns or heavy artillery to deal with the threat. Inside Tank 864, the crew took advantage of the lull to address urgent problems. The interior temperature had climbed to over 40 degrees Celsius. The men were drenched in sweat, breathing air thick with diesel fumes and gun smoke. Private Petrov, the driver, was running the engine at intervals to keep the batteries charged and prevent the diesel from gelling in the fuel lines. Kolesnikov was monitoring engine temperature and oil pressure with the intensity of a surgeon watching a patient's vital signs. And outside, barely 100 meters away, German infantry had begun to infiltrate to the tall grass and scattered trees, trying to get close enough to attack the tank with grenades and satchel charges. This was the reality of tank warfare that never appeared in propaganda films or official histories. It wasn't glorious charges across open fields. It was 5 men trapped inside a steel box, slowly cooking in the summer heat, breathing poison air, listening to bullets ping off the hull, waiting for the inevitable moment when German infantry would swarm over them with explosives. Kolesnikov climbed into the turret and took over the coaxial machine gun from Konovalov. Through the narrow periscope slit, he could see movement in the grass, the distinctive gray-green of German uniforms, the glint of sunlight off helmets and rifle barrels. He pressed the trigger. The 7.62 millimeters DT machine gun chattered, spitting out rounds at 600 per minute. Tracer rounds drew red lines through the grass. The German infantry went to ground, pinned by machine gun fire. But there were more of them now, perhaps 30 or 40 men, creeping forward by squads, using every fold in terrain for cover. They were professionals, these German soldiers, veterans of Poland and France, trained to assault fortified positions, patient and methodical in their approach. At 12:15 hours, the first German soldier got close enough to throw a stick grenade at Tank 864. It bounced off the turret side and detonated harmlessly. The explosion was loud but ineffective. German stick grenades simply didn't have enough explosive power to damage KV-1 armor. Kolesnikov traversed the machine gun and cut the soldier down as he attempted to throw a second grenade. The afternoon wore on. The German infantry pulled back, regrouped, tried again. Each time, machine gun fire from Tank 864 forced them to ground. The KV-1 was bleeding ammunition. The machine gun was consuming hundreds of rounds per hour, but it was holding. The crossroads remained blocked. German supply trucks were piling up kilometers down the road, unable to move forward, creating a massive traffic jam that was starving the forward panzer units of fuel and ammunition. And in the turret of Tank 864, Lieutenant Konovalov was beginning to realize something extraordinary. They were actually winning. One immobilized tank, 1 5-man crew, was holding up an entire German Panzer Division. But the Germans were not finished, not by a long measure. At 1540 hours, Kolesnikov heard a new sound, a deep, heavy rumble that made the ground tremble. He looked through the periscope and felt his blood turn to ice. Rolling toward them across the open field was a Panzer IV medium tank, its long 75 millimeters gun elevated for direct fire. And behind it, moving with deliberate precision, was something far more dangerous, a German 88 millimeters anti-aircraft gun, being towed into position by a heavy half-track. The 88 millimeters flak gun was the most feared anti-tank weapon of World War II. Originally designed to shoot down aircraft, German crews had discovered that its high-velocity armor-piercing shells could penetrate any Allied tank at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. If that gun got set up and opened fire, Tank 864's armor would not save them. Kolesnikov grabbed the intercom. Comrade Lieutenant, 88 millimeters gun, 1,400 meters northeast. They're setting up to kill us. Konovalov's response was immediate. Mayorov, target that gun, now, before they finished setting up. This was the moment. If Mayorov could destroy that 88mm gun before it fired, they might survive another few hours. If he missed, if the German gun crew got their weapon operational first, the story of Tank 864 would end in a ball of flame and twisted metal. Mayorov centered the crosshairs on the half-track, towing the 88mm gun, his hand steady on the firing lever, his breathing slow and controlled. He fired. If you're captivated by this true story of courage and ingenuity, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We bring you these authentic, extensively researched World War II accounts every week, and your support helps us continue this important work of preserving history. The 76.2mm armor-piercing shell left the barrel of Tank 864's main gun at approximately 662 meters per second. It covered the 1,400 meters to the German half-track in just over 2 seconds. 2 seconds during which the entire fate of this impossible stand hung in the balance. The shell struck the half-track squarely in the engine compartment. The vehicle didn't explode. It simply died, lurching to a halt as the engine block shattered into fragments of hot metal. The 88mm gun, still attached to its towing carriage, came to an abrupt stop approximately 200 meters short of its intended firing position. But the German gun crew didn't panic. These were experienced men from the 1st Battalion, Flak Regiment 43, veterans who had used their 88mm guns to destroy French Char B-1 heavy tanks during the Battle of France. They knew their weapon, knew its capabilities, and knew that even from an improvised position, the 88mm could kill any Soviet tank in existence. They began to unhitch the gun from the disabled half-track. Mayorov fired again. The second shell struck the ground just in front of the 88mm gun, throwing up a cloud of dirt and shrapnel. One of the German crew members went down, clutching his leg. The others dragged him to cover and continued working. They had the gun almost separated from the towing carriage now. In perhaps 60 seconds, they would have a position to fire. Inside Tank 864, Lieutenant Konovalov made a rapid calculation. The 88mm gun crew was in defilade, positioned behind a slight rise in the ground that gave them partial cover from direct fire. To hit them, Mayorov would need to arc his shots, lobbing high-explosive shells over the rise. But high-explosive shells lacked the precision of armor-piercing rounds. The chances of a direct hit were perhaps 1 in 4, and the Panzer IV was still advancing, closing the range, its 75mm gun traversing toward Tank 864. Yusov, load high explosive, Konovalov ordered. Mayorov, suppress that 88 crew. Keep firing. Don't let them set up. Kolesnikov, watch the Panzer IV. Tell me when it's an effective range. What followed was 3 minutes of pure chaos. Mayorov fired high explosive shells as fast as Yusov could load them. 1 round every 8 seconds, a testament to their training and desperate adrenaline. The shells detonated around the 88mm gun position, throwing up geysers of dirt, shrapnel screaming through the air. The German crew was forced to take cover, unable to complete their setup. But they weren't retreating. They were professionals, and they knew that their mission, destroy that Soviet tank, was critical to the entire divisional advance. Meanwhile, the Panzer IV had closed to 800 meters and opened fire. The 75mm gun barked. The armor-piercing shell struck Tank 864's frontal hull armor with a tremendous impact that rang through the entire vehicle like a gong. A shower of sparks erupted from the point of impact. Inside, the crew was momentarily deafened by the noise, but the armor held. The Panzer IV 75mm KW-37 gun, firing short-barrel rounds, simply didn't have enough penetration power to defeat the KV-1 thick frontal armor at that range. The German tank commander, realizing his shells were ineffective, made the tactically sound decision to close the range further, maneuvering to try to get a shot at Tank 864's thinner side armor. The Panzer IV began to circle to the left, tracks throwing up rooster tails of dust. Kolesnikov, watching through the periscope, saw the maneuver developing. Comrade Lieutenant, the Panzer is flanking us. He's trying to get our side armor. This was the fundamental problem with being immobilized. A mobile tank could rotate its hull, present its thickest armor to the threat. Tank 864 could only traverse its turret. If the Panzer IV got far enough around to their side, Even the KV-1's armor wouldn't save them. Konovalov made his decision. Mayorov, forget the 88. Target the Panzer IV. Kill it now. Mayorov traversed the turret. The electric turret drive whined as the massive gun swung toward the maneuvering German tank. The Panzer IV was at 600 meters now, moving at perhaps 25 kilometers per hour, kicking up a dust trail. It was a difficult shot, a moving target at medium range. Mayorov led the target, compensating for the Panzer IV's movement. He fired. The shot was perfect. The armor-piercing shell struck the Panzer IV in the right front quarter, penetrating the thinner hull armor and detonating inside the crew compartment. Secondary explosions followed as the tank's ammunition cooked off. The turret lifted slightly, wreathed in smoke and flame. The Panzer IV rolled to a stop, burning furiously. But in the 15 seconds that Mayorov had spent engaging the Panzer IV, the German 88mm gun crew had completed their setup. The massive gun was now positioned, loaded, aimed directly at Tank 864. The 88mm fired. At a range of 1,200 meters, the 88mm's armor-piercing shell had more than enough velocity to penetrate the KV-1's armor. The shell struck Tank 864's turret ring, the narrow gap where the turret met the hull, one of the few weak points on a KV-1. The impact was catastrophic. Metal screamed. The entire turret shuddered. For a terrible moment, Konovalov thought they'd been penetrated, that the shell had entered the fighting compartment, but the angle had been slightly off. Instead of penetrating completely, the 88mm shell had gouged a massive furrow in the turret ring armor and glanced away, leaving a scar 15 centimeters long and 3 centimeters deep. The turret's reverse mechanism shrieked in protest, but still functioned. They were wounded, but not dead. Return fire. Konovalov shouted, his voice hoarse. Kill that gun. Mayorov was already traversing toward the 88mm position. His hands moved with mechanical precision despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The German gun crew was frantically reloading, working the massive breech mechanism, preparing for a second shot that would surely finish Tank 864. It became a race. Which crew could fire first? Mayorov's hands moved. Traverse wheel, elevation wheel, range estimation, breathing control. The crosshairs settled on the 88mm gun shield. His finger tightened on the firing lever. He fired one heartbeat before the German crew completed their reload. The 76.2mm high-explosive shell struck the 88mm gun shield and detonated. The blast killed or wounded 4 of the 5-man crew instantly. The gun's barrel was knocked offline, the carriage damaged. The surviving German soldier staggered away from the position, his uniform smoking. The immediate threat was neutralized. Inside Tank 864, the crew took stock of their situation. They had been in continuous combat for over 7 hours. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Only 19 main gun rounds remaining. The machine gun ammunition was down to approximately 800 rounds. The interior of the tank was unbearably hot, the air thick with smoke and diesel fumes. All 5 crew members showed signs of heat exhaustion. Flushed faces, rapid breathing, hands trembling from adrenaline come down, and the Germans would be back. Of that, there was no doubt. At approximately 1700 hours, there was a lull in the fighting. The Germans had pulled back beyond visual range, presumably to reorganize and bring up heavier weapons. Konovalov used the breathing space to allow his crew to eat hard biscuits and canned meat from their rations, and to drink water from the tank's reserve supply. The water was blood warm and tasted of metal, but it was life itself. Kolesnikov climbed out through the turret hatch, a dangerous move, but necessary to assess the damage to the tank's exterior. What he saw both impressed and horrified him. The KV-1's armor was pockmarked with dozens of impact scars, evidence of the German shells that had struck and failed to penetrate. The right track was still hopelessly damaged, the suspension arm bent at an impossible angle, and the turret ring, where the 88mm shell had struck, showed a deep gouge that had come within millimeters of catastrophic failure. But the tank was still functional. Against all odds, they were still in the fight. Kolesnikov also observed something tactically significant. The field around Tank 864 was littered with destroyed German vehicles. He counted 2 Panzer III tanks, 1 Panzer IV, the half-track, 7 supply trucks, 1 armored car, and a disabled 88mm gun. Additionally, There were at least 15 German bodies visible in the grass. Infantry who'd been cut down trying to assault the tank. One immobilized KV-1 had inflicted more damage on the 6th Panzer Division than some entire Soviet tank battalions had managed during the first days of Operation Barbarossa. As darkness began to fall, Kolesnikov climbed back inside the tank and reported his observations to Lieutenant Konovalov. The lieutenant listened silently, then made a decision that revealed his understanding of their strategic situation. "We bought the division time." Konovalov said quietly over the intercom. "Whatever other Soviet units are in this area, they've had 7 hours to fall back and establish defensive positions. We've disrupted the German supply line. We've killed their soldiers and destroyed their equipment. We've done our duty." He paused, and the crew could hear the weariness in his voice. "Tonight, when it's full dark, we abandon the tank. We destroy the gun, drain the fuel, and withdraw on foot. We've pushed our luck far enough. Does anyone disagree?" There was silence in the tank. Then Kolesnikov spoke, his voice rough from smoke and shouting, "Comrade Lieutenant, permission to speak freely?" "Granted. We still have ammunition. We still have fuel. The engine runs. The gun fires. And we are sitting on the only good road the Germans can use to supply their advance." Kolesnikov took a breath. "I think we should stay. I think we should hold this position until the Germans kill us or we run out of ammunition, because every hour we hold is another hour that the fascists cannot move their supplies forward. Every truck we destroy is ammunition that doesn't reach their guns. Every hour we fight is an hour that's somewhere else. Soviet soldiers are digging trenches and preparing to stop them." It was the longest speech Ivan Pavlovich Kolesnikov had ever made in his military career. When he finished, the intercom was silent for a long moment. Then Private Sov, the loader, spoke. "I agree with the mechanic. We stay." "Private Petrov, we stay." "Sergeant Mayrov, we stay." Lieutenant Konovalov's voice was thick with emotion when he finally responded. "Then we stay. And may God or Stalin or whoever is listening have mercy on us, because the Germans certainly won't." What the crew of Tank 864 did not know was that their stand had already become a serious problem at the highest levels of German command. General Oberst George Hans Reinhardt, commander of the 41st Panzer Corps, had received reports of a Soviet tank blocking the critical supply route to the 6th Panzer Division. Multiple attempts to destroy it had failed. The division's supply situation was becoming critical. Forward units were running low on fuel and ammunition. The entire momentum of the Northern Pincer Army Group North was in danger of stalling. Reinhardt made the decision to commit significant resources to eliminate this single Soviet tank. If a handful of infantrymen and a few light tanks couldn't do the job, then he would send a proper combat force. The orders went out at 19:30 hours. A battalion-strength assault group was to assemble overnight and attack the Soviet position at dawn. The assault group would consist of 2 companies of Panzer tanks, a battery of 105mm howitzers, a company of combat engineers with demolition charges, and 2 companies of infantry. Air support would be provided by Junkers Ju-87 Stuka bombers. The Germans were going to crush Tank 864 with overwhelming force. Inside the tank, as darkness fell completely, the crew settled in for what they all knew might be their last night alive. Konovalov established a watch rotation. 2 men awake at all times, monitoring the periscopes and radio. Kolesnikov spent the night in the driver's compartment, listening to the engine, checking oil pressure and coolant temperature, nursing the machine like a doctor tending a critically ill patient. The V-2 diesel engine ticked and pinged as it cooled. Outside, the summer night was full of sounds. Insects, distant artillery fire, the rumble of German vehicles moving on roads kilometers away. The smell of burning vehicles still hung in the air, and somewhere out in the darkness, German soldiers were preparing to kill them. The night of June 24th to 25th, 1941, was unusually quiet around the crossroads near Raseiniai. The crew of Tank 864 took turns sleeping in shifts, 2 hours on watch, 2 hours of fitful rest in the cramped, stifling interior of the KV-1. Real sleep was nearly impossible. The tank's metal hull radiated the day's accumulated heat like an oven. Every man was acutely aware that German infantry could be crawling toward them through the darkness, that a satchel charge could come flying through a hatch at any moment. Lieutenant Konovalov maintained radio silence throughout the night. There was no point in transmitting. The Soviet command structure in this sector had completely collapsed. Their division headquarters wasn't responding. The Corps headquarters wasn't responding. For all practical purposes, Tank 864 and its 5-man crew were entirely alone, a tiny island of Soviet resistance in a sea of German-controlled territory. At 4:15 hours, as the eastern horizon began to show the first pale hints of dawn, Kolesnikov was on watch in the driver's compartment when he heard a new sound, a deep, rhythmic throbbing that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He pressed his face to the driver's periscope, scanning the pre-dawn darkness. Then he saw them, silhouettes against a lightening sky. Aircraft, many aircraft, flying low, perhaps 200 meters above the ground, approaching from the northwest. Comrade Lieutenant. Kolesnikov's voice was tight with tension. Aircraft inbound. Multiple contacts. They're coming straight for us. Konovalov was instantly awake. He climbed into the turret and peered through the commander's cupola. What he saw made his blood run cold. 6 Junkers Ju-87 Stuka bombers. Their distinctive inverted gull wings and fixed landing gear unmistakable even in the dim light. The Stukas were the Luftwaffe's most feared ground attack aircraft. Precision dive bombers that could place a 250-kilogram bomb within meters of a target. And Tank 864 was their target. Everyone inside, buttoned up, Konovalov shouted. Close all hatches. Brace for impact. The crew scrambled to secure every hatch, every opening. The KV-1 became a sealed metal box. Inside, the 5 men could do nothing but wait and listen as the Stukas began their attack runs. The Ju-87 was designed as a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Each aircraft was equipped with Jericho trumpets, wind-driven sirens attached to the landing gear that produced a terrifying, rising scream as the plane dove. The sound was meant to break the nerve of soldiers on the ground, to induce panic. The first Stuka rolled into its dive at 4:22 hours. The scream of its sirens grew louder, impossibly loud, until it seemed to fill the entire universe. Inside Tank 864, the crew gritted their teeth and gripped whatever they could hold. The scream reached a crescendo, and then came the whistle of a falling bomb. The 250-kilogram bomb struck the ground approximately 15 meters from Tank 864. The explosion was immense. The entire tank lifted slightly off its suspension, then slammed back down. Dirt and debris rained down on the hull. Inside, the crew was thrown against the interior walls. Kolesnikov's head struck the driver's periscope mount, opening a gash above his left eyebrow. Blood streamed down his face, but the armor held. The KV-1 was designed to withstand artillery fire, and even a near miss from a 250-kilogram bomb wasn't enough to penetrate its thick plating. The second Stuka dove. Its bomb landed closer, perhaps 10 meters away. The explosion was deafening even through the armor. Every instrument in the tank rattled. The radio sparked and went dead. Private Yusov vomited from the concussion, adding to the already terrible atmosphere inside the tank. The third Stuka's pilot was either exceptionally skilled or exceptionally lucky. His bomb struck the ground directly beside Tank 864's left track. The explosion tore a crater 2 meters deep and 4 meters wide. The blast lifted the left side of the tank completely off the ground. For a sickening moment, the KV-1 teetered on the edge of rolling over. Then gravity and the tank's enormous weight pulled it back down, slamming the left track into the crater with a shriek of tortured metal. Now both tracks were damaged. Tank 864 couldn't move before. Now it was even more thoroughly immobilized, sitting at a 20-degree list, half in a bomb crater. The remaining 3 Stukas made their attack runs, but their bombs fell wide. The dust and smoke from the previous explosions obscured their aim. One bomb landed 30 meters away, another 40 meters. The last bomb missed entirely, falling in an empty field 100 meters from the target. At 4:31 hours, the Stukas banked away and headed back toward their airfield to rearm and refuel. They had failed to destroy Tank 864, but they had accomplished something almost as valuable. They had marked the target clearly for the ground assault that was about to begin. Inside the tank, Lieutenant Konovalov took stock of their situation. The radio was dead, no way to call for support, not that any support was available. Kolesnikov's head wound was bleeding badly, but the mechanic insisted he could still fight. The tank was now sitting at a severe angle, which would make aiming the main gun more difficult. And the bomb crater meant that approaching German infantry would have better cover. "Ammunition count," Konovalov ordered, his voice hoarse. Yusov, wiping vomit from his mouth, checked the ready racks. 17 main gun rounds, Comrade Lieutenant. Maybe 600 rounds of machine gun ammunition. Fuel, Petrov checked the gauge. Just under half tanks. Perhaps 300 liters. Konovalov did the mathematics in his head. 17 shots. Against what was certainly going to be a major German assault. They would make every shot count, or they would die trying. At 5:45 hours, as the sun broke over the horizon, the German assault began. It started with artillery. The battery of 105 millimeters howitzers that General Oberst Reinhardt had assigned to this operation opened fire from positions approximately 4 kilometers away. The German gunners had precise coordinates from the Stuka pilots. The first salvo of 6 shells fell in a neat pattern around Tank 864, bracketing the position. The explosions were enormous, 105 millimeters high explosive shells, each containing several kilograms of TNT. The bombardment continued for 15 minutes. 18 shells. The ground around Tank 864 became a moonscape of overlapping craters. Shrapnel screamed through the air. Several shells landed close enough that the blast overpressure penetrated through the tank's ventilation system, making the crew's ears pop and ring. But again, the KV-1's armor saved them. Not a single shell scored a direct hit on the tank itself, and even if one had, the 90mm turret armor would likely have deflected it. Heavy artillery was simply not designed to engage armored targets with direct fire. When the artillery barrage lifted at 6 o'clock hours, the German ground forces move in. This was no probing attack by a few tanks and infantry squads. This was a coordinated combined arms assault by experienced troops who had conquered Poland and France. The German battle group approached in 2 groups. The northern group consisted of 5 Panzer III tanks and 1 Panzer IV, supported by a company of infantry, approximately 120 men. The southern group consisted of 4 Panzer III tanks and a company of combat engineers carrying demolition charges specifically designed to crack fortified positions. The plan was simple and effective. The tanks would suppress Tank 864 with gunfire, keeping the Soviet crew buttoned up and unable to fight back effectively, while the engineers maneuvered close enough to place demolition charges directly on the KV-1's hull. A 3-kilogram demolition charge, placed against armor and detonated, could create a breach even in the KV-1's thick plating. Lieutenant Konovalov, watching through his periscope as the German forces deployed, understood immediately what they were trying to do. He also understood that his crew was now facing a tactically impossible situation. They were outnumbered at least 10-1 in armor, 20-1 in infantry, immobilized, damaged, low on ammunition, with no support and no prospect of relief. By every reasonable military calculation, Tank 864 should simply surrender. But Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov was not a reasonable man. He was a Soviet tank officer who had sworn an oath to defend his country against fascist aggression, and he had 4 other men in his crew who had chosen to stay and fight even when they could have withdrawn. Mayorov, Konovalov's voice was steady, almost calm. "You see the Panzer IV in the northern group?" "Yes, Comrade Lieutenant. That's the command tank. The commander will be coordinating the entire assault. Kill it first." "Understood." At 6:07 hours, at a range of approximately 900 meters, Sergeant Mayorov fired the first shot of what would become known in Soviet military history as the last stand at Raseiniai. The armor-piercing shell crossed the distance in less than 2 seconds and struck the Panzer IV squarely in the turret. The penetration was clean, through the front turret armor, through the interior, out the back. The German tank commander, Hauptmann Wolfgang Schneider, was killed instantly, along with his gunner and loader. The radio operator and driver managed to bail out, but the command tank was destroyed. The effect on the German assault was immediate and dramatic. Without their commander's coordination, the 2 assault groups lost their cohesion. Individual tank commanders began making their own tactical decisions, breaking formation, trying to find hull-down positions from which to engage the Soviet tank. This was exactly what Konovalov needed. German tanks operating independently rather than as a coordinated force. Next target, Konovalov called out, "Panzer III, northern group, the one moving to our left." Mayorov traversed the turret. The manual traverse was slow. The electric system had been damaged in the Stuka attack, but his hands were steady. He fired. Another hit. The Panzer III's turret jammed, unable to traverse. The crew abandoned the tank. 15 main gun rounds remaining. The German tanks began to spread out, trying to get angles on Tank 864's thinner side armor. But the bomb crater actually worked in the Soviet crew's favor. The crater's raised lip provided partial cover for the tank's lower hull. To get a clear shot at Tank 864's side, the German tanks would have to expose themselves to the KV-1's main gun. At 6:15 hours, 3 Panzer III tanks from the Southern Group attempted a coordinated assault, advancing together to divide Tank 864's fire. Mayarov engaged the lead tank and scored a hit, but only a glancing blow that damaged the tank's tracks without destroying it. The other 2 German tanks opened fire, their 50mm guns hammering at Tank 864's turret and hull. The impacts were tremendous. Inside the KV-1, the noise was unbearable, like being inside a bell while it was being struck by hammers. Sparks flew from weld seams. Paint flaked off the interior walls. A periscope cracked from the impact stress, but none of the German shells penetrated. The KV-1's armor, designed by Soviet engineers who had studied the lessons of the Spanish Civil War and the Soviet-Finnish War, was simply too thick for the Panzer III's 50mm gun. Mayarov took his time, waited for German tanks to pause their fire to reload, and then engaged the 2nd Panzer III. This shot was perfect, a hit on the thin side armor as the German tank maneuvered. The Panzer III exploded, its ammunition cooking off in a series of secondary detonations. 13 rounds remaining, but while Mayarov had been engaging the tanks, the German combat engineers had been advancing, using the smoke and dust from the tank battle as cover. They had crawled to within 50 meters of Tank 864. Now they rose and began their final assault. 30 men carrying explosive satchel charges, moving in short rushes, covering each other with rifle and submachine gun fire. This was the moment that Ivan Kolesnikov had been waiting for. He had spent the last few minutes preparing for precisely this eventuality. He took over the hull-mounted machine gun, a 7.62mm DT machine gun with a limited traverse arc, but excellent fields of fire to the tank's front and sides. Kolesnikov opened fire. The machine gun's muzzle flashed in the dim morning light, spitting out rounds at 600 per minute. The German engineers were caught in the open, 50 meters from cover, laden with heavy explosive charges. The machine gun fire cut through them like a scythe through wheat. Men fell, clutching wounds. Others dropped their charges and dove for cover. The assault stalled, pinned down by devastating machine gun fire. In the turret, Konovalov saw another 3 Panzer IIIs attempting to maneuver for side shots. Mayarov, multiple targets, your discretion. Engage at will. What followed was 4 minutes of pure, concentrated violence. Mayarov fired as fast as Yusov could load, 1 shot every 10 to 12 seconds. Not every shot was a hit. Not every hit was a kill. But the sheer volume of accurate fire from Tank 864 was breaking the German assault. Another Panzer III destroyed, its turret blown completely off the hull ring. Another damaged, leaking fuel, withdrawing with a dead engine. Another hit in the tracks, immobilized, crew bailing out under machine gun fire. 8 rounds remaining. At 6:31 hours, the German assault broke. The surviving tanks began to withdraw, backing away from the Soviet monster that refused to die. The combat engineers retreated, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead and their explosive charges scattered across the bullet-swept ground. The infantry, seeing their armor support withdrawing, likewise pulled back to safer positions. Inside Tank 864, the crew was operating on pure adrenaline and willpower. Kolesnikov's head wound had stopped bleeding, but his face was a mass of dry blood. Yusov had vomited twice more from concussion and heat exhaustion. Petrov's hands were blistered from handling the hot machine gun ammunition. Mayarov's right shoulder was bruised black from the recoil of the gun's eyepiece striking him during the bombardment. Konovalov's voice was nearly gone from shouting commands, but they had held against a battalion-strength assault, against tanks and artillery and aircraft and combat engineers. 5 men and 1 immobilized tank had held. The cost of the Germans was staggering. In less than 30 minutes of fighting, the assault group had lost 4 tanks destroyed, 3 tanks damaged, and approximately 40 men killed or wounded. The attack had been a tactical disaster. But the Germans were not finished. Not even close. At 7 o'clock hours, as the crew of Tank 864 was rationing out the last of their water and trying to assess their ammunition situation, a German staff car approached under a white flag. Konovalov watched through his periscope as a German officer, by his insignia, a major, stepped out of the car and walked to within 100 meters of Tank 864. The officer carried no weapon. He simply stood there in clear view and shouted in accented Russian, "Soviet tank, you have fought bravely. You have done your duty, but you are alone, without support, without hope of relief. We offer you honorable surrender. Come out with your hands raised, and you will be treated as prisoners of war according to the Geneva Convention. You have our word as German officers." Inside the tank, the 5 men looked at each other. No one spoke. The offer was genuine. The Germans respected courage, and Tank 864's crew had certainly demonstrated that. Surrender now would mean survival, prison camps, perhaps eventual repatriation after the war. Lieutenant Konovalov picked up the internal communication handset and spoke quietly. "I will not order any man to continue fighting. If anyone wishes to accept the German offer, I will not think less of you. We have done more than anyone could ask. Speak now." The intercom was silent for a long moment. Then Ivan Kolesnikov, the mechanic, the man who should never have been a hero, spoke. "Comrade Lieutenant, I did not stay in this tank to surrender to fascists. I stayed to kill fascists. I have 8 more shells to fire, and I intend to fire them." One by one, the others agreed. They would fight to the end. Konovalov climbed to the commander's cupola, opened a hatch just enough to shout back to the German officer, "Tell your commander that we are Soviet soldiers. We do not surrender. If you want this tank, come and take it." The German officer stood there for a moment, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then he saluted, a crisp, formal salute that was visible even at 100 meters, and walked back to the staff car. The crew of Tank 864 had just signed their own death warrant. The rejection of the German surrender offer changed everything. Up until that moment, the assault on Tank 864 had been a tactical problem, a stubborn defensive position that needed to be eliminated to restore the flow of supplies. Now it had become something else entirely, a matter of pride, of reputation, of the fundamental question of German military superiority. How could the Wehrmacht, which had conquered Poland in weeks and France in months, be held up by 5 Soviet soldiers in one broken tank? At German 6th Panzer Division headquarters, approximately 15 kilometers from Crossroads, the staff officers gathered around maps and discussed their options. They had already committed significant resources to destroying the single Soviet tank, resources that were desperately needed elsewhere along the front. The northern pincer of Army Group North was behind schedule. Supply trucks were backed up for kilometers. Forward panzer units were running dangerously low on fuel and ammunition. But simply bypassing Tank 864 was not an option. The Crossroads defended was the only viable route for heavy vehicles. The surrounding terrain was too soft, too marshy to support the weight of supply trucks and artillery pieces. Every ton of supplies that needed to reach the forward units had to pass within 400 meters of that Soviet tank's gun. The divisional commander, General Major Franz Landgraf, made a decision that would seal the fate of Tank 864 and its crew. He ordered the assembly of what amounted to a regimental-strength battle group specifically to destroy one immobilized tank, 8 Panzer III tanks, 4 Panzer IV tanks, 2 companies of infantry with heavy weapons, a battery of 105 mm howitzers, for 88 mm anti-aircraft guns repositioned for anti-tank work, combat engineers with flamethrowers and demolition charges, and, most ominously, 2 of the division's precious few 150 mm heavy howitzers, whose shells could crack open any fortification. The assault would be preceded by a sustained artillery bombardment, followed by a coordinated ground attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Tank 864 would be hit from all sides at once, overwhelmed by sheer firepower. No crew, no matter how brave or skilled, could withstand that level of concentrated violence. The attack was scheduled for 9 o'clock hours. Inside Tank 864, Lieutenant Konovalov used a brief respite to address his crew one final time. The men gathered in the confined space of the fighting compartment, Mayorov and Yusov in the turret, Petrov in the driver's position, Kolesnikov wedged between the turret basket and the hull ammunition racks. All 5 men were exhausted beyond description. They had been in continuous combat for over 24 hours. They were dehydrated, concussed, wounded, operating on pure adrenaline. Konovalov's voice was quiet, almost gentle. Comrades, we all know what is coming. The Germans will not make the same mistakes again. They will bring everything they have, and we have 8 shells, perhaps 300 rounds of machine gun ammunition, and a tank that cannot move. He paused, looking at each man in turn. I want you to know that it has been my honor to serve with you. You're the finest crew a commander could ask for. History may forget our names, but what we have done here today will not be forgotten. We have held this position for over a day. We have destroyed at least a dozen German vehicles. We have killed their soldiers and disrupted their advance. We have bought time for other Soviet units to prepare defenses. We have done our duty. Private Yusov, the youngest member of the crew at just 19 years old, spoke up. Comrade Lieutenant, do you think anyone will ever know what happened here? Konovalov smiled sadly. Probably not. We are 5 men in the middle of a battlefield that stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. We will likely be recorded as killed in action. Our tank marked as destroyed. The Germans will not publicize that they needed a regimental battle group to kill 1 Soviet crew. And if the Soviet Union survives this war, which I pray it does, we will be 1 footnote among millions. Ivan Kolesnikov cleared his throat. The mechanic's face, still streaked with dried blood from his head wound, was oddly peaceful. Then we make these last 8 shells count. We make the fascists remember that Soviet soldiers do not break. We make them pay for every meter of Soviet soil with their blood. Well said, mechanic. Konovalov replied, well said. At 8:45 hours, the German artillery bombardment began. This was not the relatively light bombardment of 105 millimeters howitzers from the morning. This was concentrated, methodical destruction. The 4 88 millimeters anti-aircraft guns, positioned at different angles around Tank 864's position, began firing armor-piercing rounds in a carefully orchestrated pattern. The shells came from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible for the Soviet crew to anticipate the impacts. 188 millimeters shell struck the ground directly in front of Tank 864, showering the hull with dirt and rock fragments. Another struck the turret side, a glancing blow that gouged a deep furrow in the armor but failed to penetrate. A third shell hit the engine deck, penetrating the thinner rear armor and tearing into the engine compartment. Inside the tank, warning lights flashed red. The engine temperature spiked. Oil pressure dropped. Petrov, monitoring his instruments, reported the damage. Engine hit. We're losing coolant and oil. Temperature rising rapidly. Kolesnikov was already moving. He squeezed through the narrow passage into the engine compartment, ignoring the heat and fumes. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The 88 millimeter shell had penetrated the engine deck and torn through the engine's cooling system. Coolant was spraying everywhere, mixing with oil, creating a toxic fog. The V2 diesel engine was still running, but it was overheating rapidly. In perhaps 10 minutes, the engine would seize completely. Without the engine, they would have no electrical power, no power for the turret traverse, no power for the gun's recoil mechanism. The KV-1 would become nothing more than a static pillbox. Kolesnikov made a decision that epitomized the desperate ingenuity that kept Tank 864 fighting for so long. Using tools from the tank's repair kit and pieces of torn uniform as gaskets, he jury-rigged a bypass for the damaged cooling line. It was crude, inefficient, and would only buy them perhaps 30 more minutes of engine operation. But 30 minutes might be enough. While Kolesnikov worked in the engine compartment, the German artillery shifted to the 2 150 millimeters heavy howitzers. These massive weapons fired shells weighing over 40 kilograms each, with enough explosive power to demolish concrete bunkers. The first 150 millimeters shell landed 20 meters from Tank 864. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the entire rear of the tank off the ground. The second shell was closer, perhaps 10 meters. The blast wave penetrated through every gap and opening in the armor, creating overpressure inside the tank that made the crew's ears bleed. At 9 o'clock hours, the artillery bombardment lifted and the German ground assault began. 12 tanks, 8 Panzer IIIs and 4 Panzer IVs, advanced in a broad arc, approaching from 3 sides simultaneously. Behind them came approximately 200 infantry, including engineers with flamethrowers. The 88mm guns continued to fire, suppressing Tank 864, keeping the Soviet crew buttoned up. Lieutenant Konovalov, watching through cracked and damaged periscopes, assessed the situation with the cold clarity of a man who knows he is about to die. There were too many targets, approaching from too many directions. 8 shells remaining. He could kill perhaps 4 or 5 German tanks before they overran his position. The rest would close in, and the combat engineers would place demolition charges directly on the hull. Mayorov, Konovalov's voice was steady, almost calm. Engage targets at your discretion. Make every shot count. The final battle lasted exactly 7 minutes. Mayorov fired at the lead Panzer IV at a range of 700 meters. The shot was slightly low, striking the tank's lower hull and setting a blaze. The crew bailed out, running for cover. 7 shells remaining. A Panzer III closed to 500 meters on Tank 864's left flank. Mayorov traversed, agonizingly slow with only manual traverse, and fired. The armor-piercing shell punched completely through the Panzer III, entering to the front hull and exiting to the engine compartment. 6 shells remaining. The German infantry was advancing under covering fire from their tanks. Machine gun bullets rattled off Tank 864's hull like hail. Kolesnikov took over the bow machine gun and opened fire, sweeping the approaching infantry. Men fell. Others dove for cover. But there were so many of them, and they kept coming. Another Panzer IV, attempting to get a shot at Tank 864's vulnerable rear, exposed its side armor at 600 meters. Mayorov fired. A hit. The German tank shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its hatches. 5 shells remaining. At 9:04 hours, 3 things happened simultaneously that sealed Tank 864's fate. First, the jury-rigged cooling system that Kolesnikov had improvised finally failed completely. The engine temperature spiked past the red line. The V-2 diesel seized with a terrible grinding sound and died. All electrical power died with it. The turret traverse motor went silent. The gun's recoil mechanism locked. Tank 864 could still fire. The 76.2mm gun had a manual firing mechanism, but only at targets directly in the turret's current facing. Second, a German combat engineer team reached a position approximately 30 meters from Tank 864's left side. They carried a flamethrower, a terrifying weapon that could turn the interior of a tank into an oven by shooting jets of burning fuel through vision slits and ventilation ports. Third, 2 Panzer III tanks achieved firing positions on Tank 864's right flank and opened fire with their 50mm guns at near point-blank range, less than 200 meters. At that range, even the KV-1 thick armor was vulnerable. The 50mm shell struck Tank 864's right side in rapid succession. The first shell penetrated the thinner side armor and detonated inside the hull in the ammunition storage area. The explosion was catastrophic. Secondary detonations followed as the stored 76.2mm shells began to cook off. Private Boris Petrov, the driver, was killed instantly by the initial penetration. The shell passed within centimeters of his position, and the blast wave killed him before he even knew he was hit. The ammunition fire spread rapidly. Flames roared through the interior of the tank. The temperature inside the fighting compartment soared to over 500 degrees Celsius. Smoke filled every space. Lieutenant Konovalov, his uniform on fire, made one final command decision. He grabbed the intercom handset, though the electrical system was dead, and shouted, "Abandon tank! Bail out! Now!" Sergeant Mayorov threw open the turret hatch and climbed out into a storm of German machine gun fire. He managed 3 steps before bullets cut him down. He died on the hull of Tank 864, still trying to reach cover. Private Yusov followed, but the smoke and flames had disoriented him. He stumbled, fell from the turret, and broke his leg in the fall. German infantry reached him within seconds. He survived the war as a prisoner, and his testimony would be the primary source for reconstructing the events of this battle. In the hull, Ivan Kolesnikov and Lieutenant Konovalov faced a terrible choice. The ammunition fire was spreading. In perhaps 30 seconds, the entire ammunition load would detonate, turning Tank 864 into a massive bomb. They could try to bail out through the belly hatch, but that would mean exposing themselves to the flamethrower team, which was now less than 20 meters away. Kolesnikov looked at his commander. Through the smoke and flames, the 2 men's eyes met. No words were needed. They both knew they were not leaving this tank alive. Konovalov grabbed the manual firing lever for the main gun. One shell remained loaded in the breech. Through a narrow, smoke-obscured vision slit, he could see the flamethrower team preparing to fire. He pulled the firing lever. The 76.2 millimeters gun fired one last time. The high explosive shell struck the ground directly in front of the flamethrower team and detonated. The blast killed all 3 German soldiers instantly and ignited their flamethrower fuel tanks, creating a fireball that engulfed the entire area. It was a last act of defiance from Tank 864. At 9:07 hours, the remaining ammunition inside the tank detonated in a massive explosion. The blast was so powerful that it lifted the 43-ton KV-1 completely off the ground. The turret was blown off, sailing through the air to land 15 meters away. The hull split open, flames roaring from every opening. Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov and Senior Sergeant Ivan Pavlovich Kolesnikov died instantly, incinerated in the explosion that destroyed their tank. The German infantry, watching from a distance, stood in silence. Several officers later reported that there was no cheering, no celebration. The elimination of Tank 864 had cost them dearly. 6 tanks destroyed, 3 damaged, over 60 men killed or wounded, and more than 36 hours of delay to their division's advance. The crossroads was finally clear. German supply trucks began moving forward within the hour. The 6th Panzer Division resumed its advance toward Leningrad. The war rolled on, as wars do, crushing individuals and their stories beneath the weight of grand strategy and army group maneuvers. For decades, the stand of Tank 864 near Raseiniai existed only in fragments, a mention in German after-action reports, a few paragraphs in Soviet divisional histories, the testimony of Private Yusov, who survived German captivity and returned to the Soviet Union in 1945. It was not until the 1990s, when Soviet archives began to open, that historians pieced together the full story. The identification of Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov and Ivan Pavlovich Kolesnikov from partial records, the correlation of German and Soviet reports, the discovery that this single immobilized KV-1 had held up an entire Panzer Division for a day and a half. In 2005, a memorial was erected near the crossroads where Tank 864 made its stand. The memorial consists of a simple granite stone with 5 names carved into it: Lieutenant Semyon Konovalov, Sergeant Nikolai Merov, Private Alexei Yusov, Private Boris Petrov, and Senior Sergeant Ivan Pavlovich Kolesnikov. Ivan Kolesnikov, the mad mechanic who jury-rigged repairs under fire, who kept a broken tank fighting long after it should have been abandoned, who chose to die rather than surrender, was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union in 2006, 65 years after his death. His story stands as a testament to the courage of ordinary soldiers in extraordinary circumstances. A mechanic who became a hero. A broken tank that became a fortress. 5 men who held their ground when every rational calculation said they should run. In the vast and terrible narrative of World War II, Tank 864 is a footnote. But for those who study the Eastern Front, who understand the desperate early months of Operation Barbarossa, when the Soviet Union teetered on the edge of collapse, the stand at Raseiniai represents something profound. The refusal to surrender, the determination to resist, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a few more hours, a few more shots, a few more meters of ground denied to the invader. Tank 864 could not move, but it could not be moved. And in the end, that made all the difference. If this story of extraordinary courage and sacrifice has touched you, please subscribe to our channel and share this video. These stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things must not be forgotten. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is not made by nations or armies, but by individuals who choose, in moments of crisis, to stand and fight.